Good afternoon on the 10th of March, 2022, from Alfred Cope Garrett II. This is the second session with Ethan Jerome Garrett at the controls of all the electronics. Ethan is our middle son. He was born April 27th, 1963, in the Winter Park Memorial Hospital. I may have said Sarasota Memorial Hospital earlier, and that which I'm now correcting. Today, we're going to tackle two things. All three of my sons have had experience in the United States Air Force. Ethan, a retired Master Sergeant, and the others was varying periods. But one thing they say is, off we go into the wild blue yonder. That happens to be God. So we're going to discuss that, how I process that, and then we're going to hopefully get as far as talking about my three immediate families and see whether you can get some illumination to what kind of a guy I am. The search for God began very soon in my life, early. As I may have mentioned before, my father was a birthright Quaker. My mother was born to Episcopalian parents, so they had different backgrounds, religiously speaking. They both were long historical backgrounds, so they're comforting to me in that whether I go to a Quaker meeting or an Episcopal church, I realize that my forebears had the same sort of exposure to search for God. When I was a little boy in a Quaker city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I went to the Germantown meeting, which is in the borough of Germantown, was not maybe 3 miles from our house, and it was affiliated with the school, the Germantown Friends, where I went as a kindergartner in 1938. They were both on the same campus. Now, Quakerism is a very, as they call it, the Society of Friends. It's a very simple, subtle type of religious experience and expression. At the same time, once, probably on high holy days, we would go to a Episcopal church. I think it was somewhere near the borough of Albany, where I came home. Logan, as I said earlier, came home from Pennsylvania, lying in hospital to Logan, and spent my first 7 years there. And there also, my grandparents went on the trek from Logan weekly to first day meetings, first day being Sunday, and sometimes the fourth day meeting Thursday. Those were more businesslike. Quakers never have any references in the meetings to passing the plate or anything like that. They believe their worship service should be, in and of itself, focused on searching for God. So that's the background, and it's my privilege to have had parents who were interested in the church or the meeting. And they felt strong enough, they sent us to Quaker schools, and we, as I said, attended the meeting. At Germantown meeting, we sat on the woman's elders' side. In that Society of Friends, they have both men elders and women's elders. And we faced the women's elders, and then on the other side of the meeting house, the people face the men's elders. The only difference that I could see as far as back then is that when the meeting was adjourned, usually around an hour, one male elder reached over and shook hands with another of the elders, male elders. I never saw the females do that at all in that meeting. I have been to meetings where the whole structure of the meeting house was separate the men and the women. For example, Abington meeting, another suburb of Philadelphia. Now, additionally, particularly when I went in 1940 to the William Penn Charter School, which was very close to our home, that school had meetings during the school week. So we would go to an assembly room and have quiet meetings there. Essentially, the Quakers are searching, and if the Spirit moves them, they will stand up and articulate what they have been moved to say by the Spirit, God. And so that can be a very important meeting if everybody begins to get on that thread and works along that thread. The meeting can grow in spiritual power. It can be very. It's not always the way, because some people like to stand up and pontificate and talk too much. But in a good working meeting, that can be a transcendent experience for everybody. And so then if you shift over to the Episcopal Church, you have the liturgy side of it, and it's much more a experience of form, and not too much is shown about the spiritual aspects, except when people go to the altar and together in corporate worship they receive the sacraments, the body and the blood. Then you can feel a great sense of power, spiritual power, because in difficult times in my life, I could go to the altar and I realized that all my difficulties could be put aside and that I was at home in this house of God. And that's a very, very comforting experience when you have a complicated life, because you have sometimes complications which you can hardly surmount, and yet you can feel that God loves you and you are His child and you are in His home. So that's the exposure that I got. Now, I never studied religion, but I think I studied philosophy. My last degree was in philosophy. I think I studied that because I wanted to try to figure out how man figured out life in all of its dimensions. But in the case of religion, the Jesus seminar, they split hairs at 100 paces. They're trying to find out what this word means, that word means. And so, to me, that takes away from the mystery, which I believe in my heart and soul is at hand. Searching for God is so difficult because I've never really found God. And it would be very hard for me to define God, except in a triune God, you have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, I'm going to tell you about two experiences of my life, and you can see that there is material that's involved in both, but I tell you that they are moving towards that which is of a high spiritual level. The first one took place in about the 1960s. Back then in Sarasota, Florida, they had a pageant, an annual pageant. It was called King Neptune's Frolics. And we sailors came in usually to capture the city of Sarasota by some form of boat and what have you. But one of them, my cohorts, they conned me into water skiing in as a voluptuous blonde to help capture the city. And I wasn't a very adept water skier and hadn't ever dressed up as a blonde, but I got my wig down at the Players Theater and I was on my way towards that charge when all of a sudden, during a luncheon tennis match with the president and a couple of the other people in college, I threw my lower back bag out. And so our father said, Cope, why doesn't he go to my osteopath? His osteopath was a fellow named E. Chaplin, and he was in his 80s at the time when I went. And he examined my back with very, very professional and great understanding of backs. As he went down my back, he said, well, you have 3 injuries, and they are in the cervical area, which I threw one of my vertebrae out of whack at Excelsior, Minnesota, at an amusement park, which the kids and I and their mother went to when she came from Minnesota one summer. And then the second one was a thoracic injury in the middle of my back, and I had to pick up as an orderly a gentleman that was too much for my back, and so I threw that out. And then the lumbar area, I had dived off a dock when I was a little kid, and fortunately for me, I didn't break my neck, but I hit on the back of my head, and for many years the lower back would lock, and I'd have to relax, and it sort of came out. That's the area that this episode came up with. And so the doctor said he thought he could help me with everybody, and the cervical and the lumbar, but he couldn't help me. I said, don't worry about the thoracic area, because the lumbar area is really, well, when it got done, he had these manipulations, and you could tell that he really knew what he was doing. And so he said, you have to come back, and I would not advise you to do the skit. So I never did the skit. But my mother then said, maybe it would help if you could come to the healing mission at St. Boniface Episcopal Church, which she was very much involved with for over 30 years. As a matter of fact, my father was over 20 years after his retirement, and I've been there for 25 years, and my wife has been there for 20 years, so we've got almost 100 years of service. At any rate, why doesn't he come to the mission and see whether we can help you out? So I went to the mission, and very fortunately, the lady who started was a girl named Celia Conkey, and she was a very gifted healer. And she's the one that took me in. What you do is you go into a room, lie down on a examining board or that kind of like, and you will say together the Lord's Prayer, and then you will be quiet with her for about another 25 minutes. And she will just lightly go over your body with her hands. So, the extraordinary thing in that time was that day, I felt a rhythmic similarity to the adjustments of the doctor chaplain. And I was absolutely amazed at the similarities. I was also amazed that it was probable that I never moved a muscle. So that was sort of a comforting experience to have his work, chaplain's work, verified by the healing people. I left there having told the ladies in the mission that I had also been to the osteopath. I did never tell the osteopath that I'd been to them, but the second time I went to him, he examined my back as he had the first, and he said, "This is very strange. The character of your thoracic thing has changed. I think I might be able to help you with that area of my back, or your back." And interestingly enough, I just said, "Don't worry about it again." But it was amazing to me that having come from a healing session where there was just a rhythm of life, or God's touch, changed the character of back to where a professional doctor, osteopath, said that something had changed. That was a very, very important experience in my life. Now again, in my search at that mission, sometimes some of us who were working there would lay the hands, if asked, on others. And one time, I can't remember, but about 40 years ago, one of the healers was there and probably asked me, "Would you like me to lay hands on you?" And I said, "All right, yes." So I lay down on the examining table, said the Lord's Prayer. Now remember, I'm only going to have about 25 minutes more. This was the most extraordinary experience of my entire life. And it's almost indescribable. But believe me, it happened. Because slowly I found at one-ment with the universe. The most comfortable time of my life. I felt as though I was totally enjoined to the quiet beauty of the Spirit throughout the entire universe. That is a very powerful and wonderful experience because it's so comforting now at 88 years old to know that that is a place in our great, wonderful universe and God's world. So I think I've tried to do my best to give you that I continue to search for God. I sometimes have very most joyous times when I go to my church, usually every week. I'll go in there early and watch the church awaken. And it really is a thrilling experience for me to be involved in at that time. So there's a believer, there's a guy that has faith and feels very comforted by knowing there is a power in the universe which I can't define. I have never touched, I never know truthfully while I live what I will find on the other side after death. So that's what I wanted to share on that point. Now the next one I want to talk about. These are the two most important parts of my life. I have, crazily enough, I've had 3 blended families. I'm sitting with my middle son, whose mother was born in Springfield, Illinois, or at least she was put in an orphanage there when she was a baby. And it is said that she has some Norwegian heritage. Then early, let's say, she was born in 1936, October 28. And she was adopted by a couple. The man's name was Elmer Sandberg, and he was a Swede, and his mother was still alive in Minneapolis. And he and his wife had adopted a little boy before that time. He was born in 32. I don't know his birthday, but his name is Bruce Sandberg. His actual given name when he was adopted was George Ryan, I think. So I guess he was Irish, but he was raised as a Swede. So at any rate, Susan and the family lived in Hopkins, Minnesota, on a small farm, I guess there. Elmer Sandberg made his living by selling Revere ware. His wife she was of German heritage. Hauge was her maiden name, and she came from northwest Iowa. Then he died when Susan, first wife, who I married on Christmas Day, 1959. I got engaged to her on the 5th of that December, and then 20 days later we got married at St. Boniface Episcopal Church in the old sanctuary. At any rate, when Elmer died, Alma Hauge married Bill All, and so he was a traveling chemical salesman from Patterson, New Jersey, or something like that. And he had one daughter, and so at any rate, they got married, and then they moved east to Jersey, and they sent Susan to Endicott Junior College in Beverly, Massachusetts. I think that's the highest level of academics she got into. I saw her first at a store she was working in Siesta Village, and the people's name who owned it was Paul and Adelaide Clements, and she was a salesperson there. I was quite struck how attractive she was. And then another girlfriend of mine, and came and with Susan, and we went to the circus, Sailor Circus. So that was the first time I was out on anything special. And I've said since our lives together was more circus than it was conventional. But at any rate, we gave each other 3 sons. Evan Wesley is the oldest one. He was born 6/61. And the gentleman is sitting across from me doing this video and all. As I said, he was born in April of 63. And then the final son was Emlyn Sandberg. They finally got Susan's maiden name into one of the names. And his grandmother, Alma Hauge, she said early in his life, he's not an Emlyn, he's a Charlie boy. And that's what he goes by. He's a pastor, and he is a Charlie boy. So Grandma was right. So that my boys are all Air Force, and every time they'd go in there, I'd take them out to Burns Steakhouse and send them off to Lackland Air Base. And then, let's see, Evan he went to flight school, but he could have recycled, but he didn't, and it's a good thing that he didn't, because like me, I would never have been a good pilot, and it would have been a forced life for him. So he has been for many years a FedEx driver. He's quite literate. He loves to read. He's the one of them that's got a real estate ticket. I'll talk about that in career down the road somewhat. And he's been married twice. He was married to a French flame years ago. He met, I can't even remember her name, probably Bones does, you can remember, but Natalie. Yeah, Natalie. And her parents were interesting. He was German and she was French, and he went to Paris to get his education. Schaefer was the name. And she had 3 little kids and pursued him, and they married, and it was a very brief encounter as far as marriage. And so she went back to Europe and makes about $500,000 a year. And the kids are lovely kids. Marie is the cute last one. So Mrs. Schaefer and we, as family, have kept in touch over the years, and actually he's quite a good friend of Susan's. So at least we have that to go on for that marriage. And then Ethan married a girl who I'm afraid I may have overly influencing, because I said on his way to Langston, don't forget you have a good friend here in Sarasota. And so they were married in 1980, well, at any rate, December 26th or something or other. And but it was, marriage was the Episcopal Church, and I should have known. The priest never even cashed a check. I don't know where it ever went, and so that may have been a bad liftoff. But at any rate, they did some interesting things together. They were stationed in Hawaii together when Ethan was transferred to the mountain where they have the spy system of America for airplanes. And so they lived there for 2 or 3 years. And I passed through there once or twice on my way to see the youngest one out in Malaysia and in Japan. Now, Ethan, as I said, retired from the United States Air Force as a Master Sergeant in the reserves. And then he became employed by the county of Sarasota, Florida. And he does very interesting work in wastewater, which is more the electric, and the pumps and the electronic things going on there, or computer things. I don't know much of it about it, but I know he's got a lot of talent in figuring things out. And he's a very, he's the biggest of them. I have to look up to him. Yeah. And he's a wonderful son. Very easy person to be around. And then the next one is Charlie. Charlie is a very fascinating person. His wife has to be have the patience of Job, because he is definitely a complex person. As a kid, he was quite industrious and quite a hippie, and he had his paper out, and I used to have an office, and I'll get into some career, in a shopping center that I helped to build and still own a part of it. And every afternoon he'd come from school, since we weren't living together, he'd come into the office where he'd chat, and then he'd go next door. And when he was going next door, there was a guy who was a born-again Christian named Ron Shealy, who had a surf shop. So you might think, well, Charlie's just into surfing, but Ron Shealy and Charlie began to read the Bible together. And that is something that Charlie fell in love with. He's been in love with it for years, because we're talking about the early 70s. So he went into the Air Force last, and before he went, he was married on his mother's dock to Hideko Shimabuku Sharpfetter Garrett, and I think it was June 20 something or other, 1984. So he's been married almost 40 years now. She is more my age than she's closer to my age than to him. But she's been a very good wife to him all those years. When he came back from the Orient after about 10 or 11 years, he came to this property in May of 1993. And he said to me, "Dad, we'd like to come live with you because you're here alone." And so I said to him, "Well, let's try it out for 6 months, see whether it works." He's still here. I had to move from the main house, which is not big, to this house, which is really small, because there were 4 of them and only one of me. So I've reserved a life estate in this cottage, and recently I've decided to stay here for the rest of my life. The boys say they'll find somebody when I can't do things for myself, put them in a room that's here, guest room, and have a caregiver. And I like that because it gives me the freedom not being involved with a large retirement home and, this, that, and the other thing. I realized when I was in the service, and have ever since, that I lost my freedom when I was a member of the United States Coast Guard. I'll get back to that later. And so I value my freedom quite so. I think it may have been one of the reasons I had more than one marriage. But at any rate, now Charlie Garrett now has his own church called the Superior Word. He bought a storefront and expanded it. And this church is an international one when you get around to being able to wire into different electronic things, which I have no knowledge about. But he has parishioners that are from throughout the United States, a lot of them coming by here every year. And he has a wonderful ministry. He first started on the beach, church on the beach, but then he was wise enough to make this his home as far as the church is concerned. And he works terribly hard on that church. He's a real... Fortunately, God gave him the energy you would not believe. His brothers and I don't have the energy he has in accumulation. We don't have it. But he's sort of an interesting person. So I feel that I'm not a star, and I don't think any of my sons are stars, but they're good people. so that makes me very happy, and I always try to call Susan each birthday and say, "Well, happy Mother's Day." It's about all I can give to it at this time. At any rate, it so happened that Susan and I parted after, I think, 18 years, and she now lives on the mainland. She's been a very good mother, and she is a good person. And I had fallen in love with her, and now we have 2 things. We have a cabana on the Gulf, which we share, and we have a shopping center, half of a shopping center, which we share. So she is well taken care of financially, and she has a life that I don't know that much about, but now that the COVID's over, we can entertain the family together, and so that's fun. Now, the next wife I met in 1970 about at St. Boniface Episcopal Church. And like Susan and me, she has 3 children. A girl, Lori, a son, Richard Meyer Hotchkiss Jr., and a son, Mark Winfield Hotchkiss. Two boys live around here. One is an American airline pilot, and the other one is a teacher, and the pilot graduated from Florida Atlantic University. Originally he went to Florida Central, and then he went down to Florida Atlantic. And his brother graduated from Western Carolina in mathematics. He's quite a smart guy. He's really a very handsome kid, very handsome, big, tall kid. He shows his German heritage, that one. So Patricia Saunders Hotchkiss was married, I think, 4th of July, about 1959 or 60, to a U.S. Army guy. He went to West Point, and then he was in Vietnam a number of times. And when he got out, he was not very happy with the Army when he got out. Unfortunately, he's just passed the past 2 or 3 years. A nice man. And I have to say that Patricia, or I call her Patricia, she's called Pat Garrett. She took my name for business purposes, I think, because, Pat Garrett is pretty well known in American lore. And so she's a very fascinatingly interesting and quite handsome woman. And she now has a boyfriend and has for many years. And they've traveled, I think they've traveled over 100 cruises all over the world. So she's far more traveled than I was. I started traveling with her, essentially, seeing the world. And now I'm married to a girl that I met in Mount Washington, Massachusetts on a summer evening in 1943. And during the courtship, or whatever you want to say, I went to her home when I was 16 on a beautiful evening. She lived in Douglaston, Long Island, New York, in the shores of Little Neck Bay. And we were walking under the stars. It was a gloriously beautiful evening. And so I had the trepidation to ask her, I think you'll be married by the time you're 25. And she said, I don't think so. I said, well, why don't we meet on top of the Empire State Building the day you're 25, which is April 1st, 1959. And this was before Cary Grant and Deborah Carr did their Affair to Remember and Sleepless in Seattle. So we feel sort of proprietarily into that Empire State Building. And then on March 31st, 1959, my uncle took me to Herndon Airport in Winter Park, Florida, or Orlando, Florida. I was attending Wellens College at that time later. I'll tell you later. So I flew all night and got there. And I remember flying over Gravesend Bay and wanting to get into Idlewild. It was called Idlewild at that time, and now it's John F. Kennedy. And I did get in there. One of only a few planes that flew in there. It was such fog that day. And I got to the Empire State Building, got up there, and about 11, 12, 15, I saw her again. Now, there was one complicated thing. Here's a 25-year-old lady, and she brought her parents. And to tell you the truth, I bought what she said until I thought about it years later. She said that she and her father had always celebrated their birthdays together, and his birthday was April 2nd, I think 1904, and then hers was April 1st, 1934. So I think the reality of the situation is that shortly before she came here, she had met James Joseph Donovan. They call it Donovan. And he was a bit older. I think he was 8 years her senior. He had been in the United States Navy as an electrician. He went in when he was 17. He was actually in the Second World War. So they eventually married and they had 5 children. And 2 of them are rather extraordinary. One of them is the best female athlete that ever attended Tufts University. And one of them has brought an IPO through Wall Street, so he's in Fat City. But all the kids are sort of interesting kids, so she probably chose a good guy. Good guy to have her kids by. Yeah. At any rate, he died, I think it was 1993. He had a bad heart and it gave out on the streets of New York near Cumberland Presbyterian Hospital. So by the time she learned of his death, they had to call her. So she was a widow for some years, and then I was getting ready to button up our house in the north there for summer, and I had a bad broken cellar window, 12 by 15 inches pane and slab. And so I called the building supply guy whose birthday party we had met at in 1943. And he came with a pint of glass, and then he got to talking about her family. And finally, well down the family list, she said, and Jesus, the guy died in grandma. So he was very impressed by that. And so he said, would you like her address? And he gave me the name, and I got actually the name and address before he got back to me. Plus I had the telephone number. So I put in a call to her house, and she was not there. She had been in the prison ministries for the Catholic Church. Sister Nancy was the girl that got her. She belonged to the Sisters of Mercy. So, at any rate, the next morning I walked 6 miles, came back for a cup of tea. She called and we get to chatting. I probably said, this is a guy from the past, you know. So we went and talking, and I said to her, I'd like to take you to church after. I'd like to take you to lunch after my church, which is in the Valley of Episcopal Church down there. I'm going to talk about the mountain later, but at any rate, so we got together and had lunch, and we must have talked for 3 hours, during which time I had said to my youngest son, Charlie, I'd like to take you on around the tip of South America on a cruise in February. And I thought, during the luncheon, I'd rather go with her than him. So she said, well, he wouldn't even. And I said, he'll be fine. So we went on this cruise around South America, south. To prove a point, I had always thought in New Zealand, when I was down there, that Invercargill was not the southerlymost city of the world. And in fact, I think Ushuaia in Argentina is. But we did all that stuff, and then we got engaged in the Falkland Islands. And she calls up, and her daughter, little daughter, who's an athlete, she said, did he get down on his knees? So I hadn't, so I had to, after that was concerned. And the whole thing was that we could not tell anybody, so we had to wait till a year later to marry in the church up in Massachusetts. and we eloped. That winter I conned her into eloping to Block Island, Rhode Island, and Kimberly Gaffett, the senior warden there, married us on the steps of the porch of the Spring House Inn up there on top of the mountain, the hill there. This has been a very good marriage for me. It's been a quieter marriage, and it's been just. She's a very nice human being. She's not only externally beautiful, but she's beautiful inside. And so right now I'm hurting because about 4 years ago, she began to have memory difficulties, and they progressed to where she decided she wanted to go into a home, and she's now about 1,200 miles from me. I call her every day. But today I learned that she's now got a full-time wheelchair, and she's 3/4 of a year younger than I am, so you wonder why a strong woman, and who's younger, I just feel sad that she's had that come on her. Now I'm going to pause now because I feel that I've addressed, well, I'll tell you, I got married 5 times to these 3 ladies. Susan, the first one I only married 1 time, but the second one I married at St. Boniface Church in Sarasota, Florida, and then again in the Vanderbilt University chapel, the head of the Vanderbilt University School of Religion, Jean Tassell, performed the wedding, and then we adjourned to Opryland. That was in June 13th, 1987. And then with Anne, we were married June 12th, Block Island, Rhode Island. And then again in September the 12th at Mount Washington, Massachusetts, the old church there, where I had hoped years ago to have been married to her. But, so that's where it's at. I will want to be married when I die to Anne. She survived me. I don't have any motivations to ever marry again. As a matter of fact, I've made a decision to live in this house. I don't want to move out of this house. I want to stay in this house. But I don't think it's too small to have 2 people charging around. And so I guess I'll spend my life pretty much solo here, unless somebody will be a good companion for me. We just have to see how that works out. I think right now I want to pause, maybe talk with Bones a little. And so if you shut it off, can you shut it off, Bones?